Well, Eskom's Chief Financial Officer, Khalid Kasim, has justified the power utility's 20.5% tariff increase request, saying that the power utility needs to recover operational costs. Kasim says that the utility's 400 billion rand debt is another major reason for this request.
And the reason is it costs money to produce electricity. So effectively the application says the cost of recovering those operational costs, that needs to be recovered from the regulator and effectively the consumer. And then over and above that, we've got the 400 billion debt that was mentioned. We need to service that. If we can't service it as Eskom, we would then have to approach government and national treasury to basically fill the gap. And as I've indicated in my closing, National Treasury has already given us commitments, and they're saying basically they don't have any more appetite for further commitments.
Let's talk more about the Eskom NERSA application for an increase in tariffs for 2022-2023. We're joined now by Director at Virtual Energy and Power, Clyde Mallinson. Clyde, a very good evening to you. Welcome to the program. Has Eskom managed to convince you that it should get this increase?
Evening, Jen Bakili, and evening to all of your viewers. Well, you know, this tussle with Eskom and NERSA and tariff adjustments has been going on for, as long as I can remember, 10, 12 years now, maybe longer. And we just keep doing the same and thinking things are going to change. And until we make fundamental changes and recognize that there's a major disruption happening globally in the energy supply industry, we're going to get caught in this continual trap of Eskom needing increases to run an aging last century fleet of electricity producers, and at the same time there's this massive disruption taking place. So it's more of the same, and what we really need to do in this particular instance is it's essential that NERSA regulate and give a pro-poor increase. Because people in this country coming out of COVID and people in the country generally just simply can't tolerate and can't begin to conceive of a 20% power increase.
What would be a fair
percentage in the tariff is?
Excuse me, Clyde, we lost you there for a moment. I was asking, what would be a fair pro-poor tariff increase?
Well, I've done some calculations, and I'll show that if we got our policy correct in this country about our future electricity plan, we could conceivably start thinking about electricity discounts or decreases into the future. And that's what I think would be fair. So at this point in time, because we haven't got our policy correct and we've left things a little bit too long, we can't move into that phase immediately. So I think something around about a CPI increase now is the maximum we should be looking at, and we should then be tossing the problem back to National Treasury and to the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy and the policy makers, and saying Eskom has to do what the policy makers say, NERSA has to regulate according to policy, and at the moment the policy is wrong. And so any amount of regulation or toing and froing between NERSA and Eskom is almost like a side theatrical act when the core piece, the core drama is taking place in the reluctance to embrace the new energy future that the country needs and needs to move into rapidly.
I'll come to the energy future in a moment, but in the interim then, while all of that is being read up on, shall we say, and they're trying to adapt, what needs to happen? Where will Eskom find money? Because it says to generate power, it needs money. We know its infrastructure is failing. We've got incomplete power stations, but people want the lights to be on every day, all day.
What I can tell you is that if there's a 20% increase, we're going to see two things happen. Mass defection from the grid and more people not paying for electricity simply because they can't pay, whether they would want to or not. So what I'm suggesting is that we grab this thing once and for all, and that the government inject an equity injection into Eskom to basically liquidate its loan, and then say I'm relying on good policy to allow Eskom over the next 15 years to start paying me dividends that essentially will repatriate the loan that I've just given you, or the equity that I've just given you. I can't see any other way out of it. I certainly wouldn't and can't tolerate a 20% electricity price increase, and I'm fortunate enough to probably be able to manage it. But I just think of those that are on SASSA grants or worse, the unemployed. I guess they don't have electricity in the first place at the current cost.
What about then, Clyde, you mentioned the issue of government possibly pouring in more money into Eskom. That would likely run into the hundreds of millions, if not billions. But it has been criticized over the last 15 years, 12 to 15 years, some saying Eskom has simply been a financial black hole. Has that assessment changed?
No, that's what's been happening, and what has to happen now is that the liquidation of Eskom's debt needs to go hand in hand with a plan for a decarbonisation of our economy and a switch to make everything electric, from motor vehicles to buses to heavy industrial processes. And we've all seen it. If we make a bold move as a country in that direction, then just to give you an example, we at a very poor credit rating at a country at the moment. If we can increase our credit rating by 1 or 2 notches, the interest that we currently repay on our national debt, the saving we would make on that would be enough to finance the Eskom debt.
Let me ask
but we need a plan. We need a bold plan. We can't just pour the money in chasing after the old. We need a bold plan to build out a new electricity future.
Let's talk about the plan then and what the changes have been in the global energy sector, which South Africa needs to adapt to. How does Eskom begin to do that on a limited budget especially?
Well, the plan I've got is that Eskom doesn't have to spend a cent on the new fleet. The new fleet will primarily be solar photovoltaics, or PV, wind and battery storage. And I have a model whereby 10 million South Africans invest in green bonds to actually build that fleet. And then it's up to Eskom and private contractors to manage and run the fleet on behalf of those 10 million South Africans who actually own that fleet. And they will get very nice dividends from that fleet, which will exceed the kind of dividends you get from the typical pension fund at the moment.
And in terms of who is taking charge for the future of Eskom, do you get the sense that Andre de Ruyter and his leadership are now calling the shots? Because a constant criticism as far as the state of our SOEs in this country has been that you've got boards and CEOs in place, but very often it is government wanting to call the shots, often to the detriment of the entities.
Yeah, look, I think Andre de Ruyter has been given a lot of leeway by the minister responsible for Eskom. But the problem is, and the underlying problem is, that there's a different ministry who dictate, if you like, or suggest what we need to build to replace the current fleet. And those different things reside under different ministers. So with the best will in the world, if the integrated resource plan for South Africa says we're going to build more coal and nuclear, there's nothing Andre de Ruyter can do about it except try and rationally discredit such strange ideas. So what needs to happen is that there needs to be collective leadership shown in the country to actually realize that the situation that we're in at the moment is untenable. There are some silver linings, and one is that everything's got much cheaper. We've messed around for 5 years not doing anything. And storage has come down 90% in the last 10 years, and it's due to go down another 80% in the next 10 years. And we all know that wind and solar have come down tremendously in cost. But it doesn't help if these technologies reduce in cost and we're not building any of it. You know, that's the situation we find ourselves in. We've now waited, as it were, to a point where these things are now the cheapest sources of electricity in the world, and South Africa is wonderfully endowed with renewable resources, but we're not doing anything about it. It's almost like, we're stuck in a lacuna at the moment.
Clyde, good to speak to you. Clyde Mallinson, Director at Virtual Energy and Power, speaking to us on News at Prime. Thank you.
Thanks very much.